A state of emergency in Egypt after more than 40 people are killed in church bombings. President Sisi promised security. So what happened? Also on today's program, Somali pirates back with a vengeance. Security forces recover another hijacked ship, but the crew's been taken hostage. Why has piracy returned to Somali waters? And violence in Venezuela as police crack down on protesters demanding an end to Maduro's rule. I'm Imran Garda, and this is the Newsmakers. Suicide bombings ripped through two churches in Egypt, turning scenes of devotion into devastation. It was Palm Sunday, one of the holiest days of the Christian calendar. Attacks have targeted Egypt's Coptic minority before, but this was the deadliest in years, killing more than 40 people. Daesh claimed responsibility. The group and its affiliates have been pushing Christians out of the Sinai Peninsula for months. Have they now expanded their reach to other major Egyptian cities? President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi seized power in a coup, but won support from the Christian minority after promising to better protect them. It was a trade-off the West seemed happy for Egypt to make, giving up democracy for greater security. But after this attack, many are wondering if they've been getting a fair deal. Egypt's government has announced a 3-month state of emergency. But for a country that endured 3 decades of emergency rule under Mubarak, there are concerns about the potential for abuse. Will emergency laws throttle what little freedoms remain? Today's newsmaker is Egypt's church bombings. And we begin with this report from Yvette McCullough.
One of the deadliest days in decades for Egypt's Christian minority. And it struck during one of their holiest. More than 40 people were killed in twin suicide attacks on Coptic churches on Palm Sunday. The first happened in Tanta. The attacker managed to slip past security and detonate his bomb in the front pews of the church. Another blast followed just a few hours later, outside a church in Alexandria. The head of the Coptic church was attending mass inside. At least 44 people were killed in the explosions. Daesh has claimed responsibility. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi responded by deploying more troops across the country and declaring a state of emergency.
احنا بنعلن حالة الطوارئ مش أبداً إلا عشان نحمي بلدنا ونحافظ عليها ونمنع أي مساس بقدرتها أو بمقدراتها.
Coptic Christians make up 10% of Egypt's population and have been targeted by terror groups before. In December, Daesh announced its intention to target Copts, attacking a church in Cairo, killing 25 people. It has also increasingly carried out small-scale attacks on Copts in the Sinai Peninsula, causing hundreds to flee in recent months. One of the central promises of President Sisi has been to boost security and stamp out extremism. Just last week, US President Donald Trump praised Sisi for his efforts to combat terrorism. But to some, Sunday's attacks have highlighted failures in intelligence and security. Christians have been among Sisi's staunchest supporters. But with every attack, and as Sisi renews his promise to keep the community safe, there's growing frustration.
The Minister of Interior should be sacked. The head of security directorates of Tanta and Alexandria should be sacked. All those who were not prepared for a day like this should be sacked.
The security should start pulling themselves together because it is unjust for the innocent to die like that. Terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. Until when will we remain like that? The officials have to deal with this.
More security has been put in place ahead of Easter celebrations this weekend. But will heightened security and a state of emergency be able to help protect Coptic Christians against this rising threat? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from London is Sami Hamdi. He's the editor of The International Interest, a current affairs magazine with a focus on Middle Eastern politics. And in Cairo, Timothy Caldas. He's an Egypt expert at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Timothy Caldas, let me begin with you. Daesh did it, but to what extent is the state responsible for failing to protect its citizens?
Well, we're still gathering information about how everything unfolded. So far, it does seem that in Tanta in particular, there were security failures that contributed to this attack being successful. Just a week before the bombing, another bomb had been found in the same church and was dismantled, which should have alerted security officials to the fact that this church was specifically being targeted, and extra measures should be taken to prevent something like this. But just yesterday evening, reportedly the governor of Gharbeya, the province in which this church is located, said that the metal detector at the church wasn't actually functioning. So if that is the case, then it suggests that there was serious neglect there, and that helped, unfortunately, allow for the attacker to enter the church undetected. With respect to Alexandria, I think the situation's a little more complicated. Just before the mass, the director of security did have them move the metal detector outside of the church, which actually probably helped to minimize the number of casualties, because the attacker was stopped at the metal detector, as we saw in the video. And when he set off the metal detector and wasn't going to be able to enter, he set off his bomb from the outside rather than inside the crowded church. So we have two different bombings with probably two different situations to examine. Of course, more investigation needs to be undertaken to see exactly what happened.
Sami Hamdi, part of the appeal of President Sisi to many inside Egypt and outside is, hey, okay, maybe there won't be as many rights as you would like, but I'll keep you safe. This contradicts that. Tell me how you read the situation, Sami.
The way I see the situation is that although we think about the victims, to be honest, this is in a very crude, sadistic way, a PR coup for Sisi. Many people will be criticizing the security situation outside of Egypt, but inside of Egypt, it merely seems to confirm Sisi's continued statements that people are trying to destabilize Egypt. People are trying to destabilize the Egyptian regime, that we are under threat, Sami, that we are surrounded, and that we need to protect ourselves. No, but hang on a second here. We are looking at the symptoms and not the disease here. These events take place in unstable societies. The instability in Egypt has been brought about first and foremost by a military coup, by the ousting of a democratically elected president, followed by repression and oppression of every single opposition voice against Marshal Sisi or against General Sisi. Now, as a result, you've created an environment that is conducive to terrorism.
Sure.
Now, we're not talking about here whether it's right or wrong. We're simply talking about the reality
Daesh is hitting
that's on the ground.
democracies as well, right? So how does that square with your theory?
No, but the thing is, what I'm saying is that Daesh is hitting the democracies, Daesh is hitting Egypt and the like, but Daesh is not the only body that is bombing Egypt. Egypt has seen many other different security disturbances. The only reason this is getting particular media attention is because it involves Coptic Christians, of which the Europeans and the West are particularly interested in protecting. This is not the sole security incident that has taken place in Egypt this year. This is, however, the most covered, the most media coverage that has been given to a security situation. I fear that we are looking at this situation in isolation, and as a result, we are giving our discussion to how the security apparatus operates, what they might have done wrong, what they might have done right, ISIS and the like. In reality, we should be looking at it as a whole, as to what is going on in Egypt, what environment has been created that has allowed the likes of ISIS to be able to commit such attacks on the Christian population.
Timothy, does any of that sound reasonable to you?
Only a little bit. Look, here's the thing. As you rightly pointed out, Daesh attacks people in all sorts of countries. We've seen them attack in France, in the United States, in Australia. So to say that this is exclusively a result of the coup is frankly just untenable. I have plenty of problems with the Egyptian government, and I have plenty of criticisms on the record, but that doesn't mean that we can confuse these issues. Beyond that, I would point out that Copts have been attacked before the coup. They were attacked in the 90s by Islamists militants. They've been attacked over the decades. So this is not a product of one particular political event. So it just simply is an ahistorical analysis to suggest otherwise. Now, that's not to say that there aren't issues that have developed in recent years that have contributed to the situation, but certainly we need to take, if we're going to take a step back, as your guest suggests, I suggest that we take a much larger step back than is being proposed when understanding the situation. Now,
Timothy, let me jump in for a second. As you mentioned, there have been attacks against Coptic Christians in the past, preceding even the formation of Daesh as an organization. With that in mind, some of their motivation might be twofold. On the one hand, to attack Christians for being Christians or for whatever they represent in the West and so on. And on the other hand, to cause divisions within Egyptian society. Is it working, Timothy?
I don't really think so. I mean, look, part of the reason why this is a headline is not simply because they're Christians, but also because in general, the militant groups operating in Egypt don't tend to target civilians with the exception of Daesh. So that is also unique to in terms of attacks in Egypt. Most of them otherwise focus on the security forces. Now, with respect to division, I mean, the reality is that Egyptians kind of have a serious problem with terrorism because they recognize that it hurts their livelihood, it hurts the economy of the country. They went through this in the 90s with lots of terrorist attacks that did a lot of damage to their well-being. And so it's a pretty universal condemnation of terrorism in Egypt. So I don't think this violence is going to play that well domestically for Daesh. I think that quite the contrary, they will be seen as hurting Egypt and hurting Egyptians.
Right. Sami, the government says they need a 3-month-long state of emergency to put a lid on this. What do you think about that?
Just quickly, I'll answer that particular question. Just 10, 15 seconds on the point about ISIS targeting democracies in the West and the like. All these democracies that have been attacked are also unstable. You have the UK government, which is involved in airstrikes in Syria, heavily involved in the Middle East, conducting surveillance measures against this Muslim population.
We're going off on a tangent. Let's have that discussion another time. Please, could you answer the question? Please, Sami. Please, could you answer the question?
With regards to your question, Imran, the government needs a state of emergency. Egypt has been in a de facto state of emergency since Sisi came to power. Egypt has been under threat since Sisi came to power. That's been reflected in the number of journalists that have been in prison, in sweeping arrests of opposition and the like. So Sisi today to declare a state of opposition should really strike fear in the hearts of every single Egyptian, because if Egypt hasn't been in a state of emergency in reality until now, then who knows what the state of emergency looks like in the eyes of General Sisi.
Okay, so Timothy, Egypt's already in a state of emergency. What are they going to do now? What sort of expanded powers is the state going to have now that they don't already have?
Well, another way to look at what you're pointing out is that it's true that more or less a lot of the powers or liberties that the police have taken over the past few years would be reflected in a state of emergency, which is part of the reason why it's not clear to what extent things are going to materially change in Egypt now that we're officially in the state of emergency. I mean, according to the state of emergency that's been proposed, there can be warrantless arrests and detentions, but at the same time, we've had people that have been held without charge for long periods of time already. We've had people who have been detained for years without a conviction in pretrial detention. So it's not clear to what extent this is going to change the actual behavior of the state and to what extent this is a measure basically to tell the Egyptian people that action is being taken, not unlike what we've seen elsewhere. So I don't know how much is actually going to change yet. It's still a little bit early to tell, but the reality is that the government hasn't felt that bound to obey the Constitution in the past, and I wouldn't necessarily assume that that's going to change under these circumstances.
Sami, do you have any sympathy for the Egyptian state, given that it's being attacked by two forms of Daesh in many ways? Wilayat Sinai, those in the Sinai, the affiliate that pledged allegiance in 2014, and then these sorts of attacks in urban centers where people, fighters, learned their trade in places like Syria. Do you have any sympathy that they're under attack from two strands of Daesh?
Look, nobody wishes on a country nobody wishes these attacks on any particular country, and it's inevitable that people will have sympathy for anybody having to deal with it. But on the issue of Sinai, I remember a citizen of Sinai many years ago who said that the Israeli army are more merciful than the Egyptian army. Sinai is far more complicated than simply a terrorist organization popping up and causing chaos. It's a far more complex issue. I think with regards to Egypt, with Egyptian involvement in Libya, with the domestic instability as well, like I said earlier, I think the environment is conducive to these particular security attacks. So I do have sympathy. It's an unenviable task for anybody, but I think these are symptoms. I think the disease is, if Sisi can reconcile Egyptian society, if he can come to some sort of political situation, political reconciliation with the various political parties, with the various opposition figures, then we might be able to see genuine, tangible results with regards to tackling security. However, as the situation currently stands with the polarization in Egyptian society, it seems an impossible task for General Sisi to be able to tackle these particular security situations.
Final question for you, Timothy. Are Coptic Christians less safe now in Egypt in 2017?
Less safe than last year? I mean, undoubtedly. ISIS announced a campaign that's going to be targeting Coptic Christians, and unfortunately, we've seen them fall through with that on Palm Sunday. And they coordinated an attack in 2 cities, more or less simultaneously, within a matter of an hour or 2 apart. And I don't think they have any intention of stopping. So certainly there's an elevated threat at places of worship and even in their homes, as we saw in Sinai, where a number of Copts were basically driven to flee. So yeah, they're under a serious threat, of course.
Okay, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you, Tim Kaldis and Sami Hamdi. Thank you very much. They were once the world's most dangerous waters. Sailors used to call the sea off the coast of Somalia the route of fear. Pirates attacked hundreds of ships, trying to hijack vessels and ransom their crews. It cost the shipping business billions of dollars. So billions more were spent trying to secure the seas. And it proved a success. But then last month, a ship was hijacked for the first time in 5 years, and then another just on Saturday. So what's happened? Randolph Nogel explains.
Beyond the shore, pirates and the Somali Navy exchange fire. Some of the straight bullets hit villagers in the town of Basaso. This ship, hijacked by the pirates, was freed along with its crew following the gun battle.
We are dead and born. You know, what I can say, dead and born. At 68 years I am dead and born.
It was the first large merchant vessel hijacked in Somali waters since 2012. That was when international Navy stepped up patrols and ships transiting the Gulf of Aden took on board security. A NATO naval force pulled out of the area in December, citing a decline in pirate attacks. A European force remains. And while they have a mandate to protect these waters, they're not empowered to block illegal foreign fishing fleets that contribute to the economic despair that drives piracy.
The fishing communities, just like the communities inland, are desperate, starving, there's a drought. And when you see sitting there just off your shore a foreign fishing vessel that you know is hoovering up millions of dollars worth of bluefin tuna, you're going to feel pretty upset.
Somali fishermen say they've taken up arms to protect their shoreline. They say Yemeni and Indian boats routinely enter their waters illegally and cut their fishing nets. A lack of Somali government surveillance has led armed groups to extract fines, which in some cases look a lot like ransom payments, and this has shot up in recent months. Whether piracy will become big business again on Somalia's coast is unknown. What is clear is that it thrives in a place defined by illegal overfishing and poor out-of-work fishermen. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this now, I'm joined by Andrew McLaughlin from Nairobi. He's the Program Officer of Global Maritime Crime Program at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. These latest incidents, are they just an anomaly, or are the pirates back in business?
I certainly wouldn't say it's an anomaly. I wouldn't go so far as to say the pirates are back in business. I would say they are to an extent, but there's a number of elements to the question. Firstly, I think the extent to which they come back relies heavily on the international community response in the next few months. And if it's not strong, I think we'll see a larger resurgence. If the response is effective, we may see it decrease again. But I think it's important to note, piracy never went away. The pirates still existed. The desperation in Somalia was still there for young men with no other opportunity. And the business model, as piracy became more difficult, shifted into other areas of maritime crime, but the business model and the networks were never disabled. They were just dormant.
You say the desperation for young men in Somalia. Is that, in your interpretation, the root cause? Are you certain of that?
I think it is certainly one of the key root causes. Young men in Somalia, and there's the fishing element as well. Men who were working in fishing have been pushed out of that industry by illegal foreign fishing. And you couple that with the desperation of the drought, which is a new element, and the ongoing factor of no alternate livelihoods for young men. I think it is one of the key root causes, if not the root cause.
Do these pirate groups operate like cartels of the sea or cartels of the beach? I mean, are there big ones and small ones and medium-sized ones and so on?
There certainly are. They say that there's 8 pirate groups who are active at the moment. And these are predominantly formed along clan lines. As you probably recognise, Somalia is a clan-based society with 4 major clans and then a number of sub-clans underneath. So predominantly a group will be formed along one clan line, and they'll have different elements of sub-clans within the broader group. And that's for reasons such as facilitation of perhaps weapons, movement of money, and also access to different beaches which may be controlled or in the area of influence of a certain other sub-clan.
And Andrew, you said in your first answer, you said that if the international community doesn't do enough, then perhaps the pirates will be back in business. So let me ask you, what do you want the international community to do?
There was 4 measures which helped to suppress piracy in the last 5 years. And those were capacity building by organisations, and UNODC played a big role in capacity building. And one of the key factors that addressed the pull, so one of the key elements addressing the pull factors of piracy was UNODC's piracy prosecution model, which enabled international navies who caught pirates on the high seas to hand them off to other East African nations and have them prosecuted on their behalf. Because before that happened, it was a catch and release policy whereby if you were caught, there was no effective measure in place for you to be prosecuted. So the navies would take your weapons and other pirate equipment like ladders, and you were then free to go back to shore and try again. So that was number 1. The second was obviously the international navy presence on the Horn of Africa. The third was the International Maritime Organisation's Best Management Practice 4, which was guidelines for the shipping industry on how to make yourself a harder target for pirates. So that involved putting up razor wire or barbed wire, charging fire hoses, and basically making the ship look hard. So if a pirate looks at it, they think, let's not go for that one, let's go for another one. And part of that was also keeping effective lookout and for merchant ships to transit further from the coast and at higher speed to get out of the danger area quicker. And the last measure was embarking private armed security teams into merchant ships. And I think the reason we've seen pirate re-emerge is perhaps complacency, and there's also financial factors for all of those 4 elements have seen everyone become people have become slightly complacent and have toned down those measures, and we've seen a reduction in the Navy presence. And I think given all of those factors, it was a matter of when, not if, piracy re-emerged.
Well, you've given some good advice here. Hopefully the people that matter will be watching and heeding that advice. It's a fascinating, if somewhat worrying development happening off the Horn of Africa. Andrew, it's been good to talk to you. Hope to have you on the program again sometime soon. For a fifth straight day, Venezuelan police have clashed with thousands protesting against President Maduro's government. Demonstrations began after Maduro stripped the opposition-led parliament of power, then reversed his decision. The government is responding forcefully to quell what it says is an organized coup. But protesters say innocent civilians are being targeted. Take a look.
Enfrentando en este momento y estamos derrotando en Venezuela, claro que sí, pero lo está dando la derecha.
Que esta inhabilitación que me han impuesto sea más razón, más fuerza para salir mañana a las calles de Venezuela.
We'll have more on the crisis in Venezuela next week, but that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.